meets truth. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. And if you felt it was really worth it, hit the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories like this. The night in Manhattan had that heavy silence that only big cities know. When the offices empty out, the skyscraper lights flicker like artificial stars, and the constant hum of the metropolis transforms into a distant buzz, almost forgotten. It was in this gap between day and dawn that Carol Hayes started her shift. Night cleaner, invisible. Just another shadow among the glass corridors and polished marble of Blackwood Tower, the most imposing building on Fifth Avenue. Carol pushed her cleaning cart down the 43rd floor hallway, the wheels squeaking softly against the gleaming floor. The smell of lavender disinfectant mixed with the metallic scent of air conditioning filled her lungs. She wore the standard navy blue uniform, brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, hands already calloused from so much scrubbing, cleaning, erasing the marks of a world that never saw her. At 23, Carol carried the silent weight of someone who grew up without roots. Raised in a forgotten orphanage in the suburbs of New Jersey, she'd learned early that no one was coming to save her. So she saved herself, studied at night, worked during the day, and now she was here, cleaning up the remains of a world that would never be hers. But Carol had something money couldn't buy: dignity, and a strange ability to see beauty where others saw only dirt. That night, though, something was different. She looked at the wall clock, 2:30 in the morning. The shift was quiet, almost meditative, but when she passed by the private elevator, the one that went straight up to the penthouse, the only floor she had never cleaned, she noticed the door was slightly open. Just a crack. A silent invitation, or a mistake. Carol hesitated. She knew she shouldn't. The penthouse was forbidden territory, reserved exclusively for the heir of Blackwood Enterprises, Preston Blackwood. A man she'd never seen in person, but whose name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear through the hallways. They said he was brutal in business, ruthless, cold as the steel that held up that skyscraper. But curiosity is a strange force, and Carol, even while trying to be invisible, had always been driven by questions she shouldn't ask. She took a deep breath, felt her heart speed up slightly, and pushed the elevator door. She got in. The lit panel had only one button. P. Penthouse. She pressed it. The doors closed with a mechanical whisper, and the cabin began to rise, fast, smooth, as if being pulled by invisible threads toward the sky. When the doors opened, Carol felt the air change. The penthouse wasn't just luxurious, it was a statement. Mirrored black marble floors, glass walls offering a 360-degree view of Manhattan, the entire city pulsing below like a living organism, illuminated, sleepless. Minimalist Italian leather furniture. A fireplace burning even in summer, crackling softly. The smell of burning wood mixed with something more subtle, expensive whiskey and a masculine fragrance, woody, intense, unsettling. Carol took a few steps, the sound of her rubber boots muffled by the Persian rug. She held the cleaning cloth in her hands like it was a shield. She looked around, fascinated and frightened at the same time. This place felt like a fortress, a kingdom isolated from the world. And then she saw him. He was standing with his back turned, facing the glass wall, hands in the pockets of perfectly tailored dress pants. White shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, defined forearms. Slightly messy black hair, as if he'd run his hands through it several times. Broad shoulders, upright posture, silent. Watching the city like a predator watches its territory. Carol froze. She wanted to back away, but it was too late. Without turning around, he spoke. His voice was deep, controlled, but loaded with something she couldn't immediately identify. "Do you always clean with this much dedication? Or is it only when someone's watching?" Carol's heart raced. She swallowed hard, trying to find the words. He still hadn't turned around. He just remained there, motionless, as if he knew exactly the effect he caused. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I thought the floor was empty. I shouldn't be here." He finally turned around, and when his eyes met hers, Carol felt the ground shift. Preston Blackwood was devastatingly handsome, but not in a conventional way. There was something dangerous about his beauty. Sharp jawline, full lips that never seemed to smile completely, dark grey eyes that pierced like sharp blades. But it wasn't just that. It was the intensity, the way he watched her. Not with contempt, not with indifference. It was as if he were trying to solve a puzzle, as if, somehow inexplicably, he saw her. And that terrified her. "You don't need to apologize," he said, taking a step toward her. "But you don't need to lie either." Carol frowned, confused. "Lie? You didn't come in here by mistake." He tilted his head slightly, eyes fixed on hers. "You came in because you wanted to see, because something inside you is too curious to follow rules." She felt the blush rise to her cheeks. How could he know that? They'd never spoken before, never even crossed glances in the hallways. And yet he seemed to know her better than she knew herself. "I should go," Carol murmured, taking a step back. "You should," he agreed, "but you won't." It wasn't a question. It was a certainty. They stood there, still, separated by only a few meters, but the distance seemed charged with electricity. Carol felt her skin tingle, the air becoming denser, hotter. She knew she should leave, knew this man was dangerous. Not physically, but in other ways. Ways she didn't understand yet. Preston walked slowly to a side table and poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He held one out to her. "Drink with me." "I don't drink during work," she replied, her voice firmer than she expected. He smiled for the first time. A small smile, almost imperceptible, but one that completely transformed his face. For a moment, Preston Blackwood seemed human. "Then you're not working anymore. You're here. With me." He raised his glass. "And I rarely extend invitations." Carol knew she should refuse. Knew this was madness, but there was something in the way he looked at her, as if she were the only real thing in that world of glass and steel, that made her stay. She took the glass. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and it was like touching fire. They drank in silence, eyes locked on each other. The taste of whiskey burned her throat, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. It was as if something invisible held them there, in that moment, suspended in time. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. Carol Hayes." He repeated it, as if memorizing every syllable. "Carol." And the way he said her name, slowly, deliberately, broke something inside her. Preston moved closer, and she didn't back away. He raised his hand and, with a gentleness that completely contradicted his brutal reputation, brushed a strand of hair from her face, tucking it behind her ear. His fingers lightly grazed her skin, and Carol closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the touch reverberate through her entire body. When she opened her eyes, he was inches away. So close she could feel the heat emanating from him, the woody scent mixed with whiskey, breath against breath. "Do you feel this?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. She couldn't answer, but she didn't need to. The answer was in her eyes, in her shallow breathing, in the way her body involuntarily leaned toward his. Preston touched her face with both hands, as if holding something fragile and precious. And then, slowly, so slowly it seemed like an eternity, he brought his lips close to hers. But he didn't kiss her. He stopped millimeters away, their lips almost touching, letting the tension build until it became unbearable. "Tell me no," he whispered against her mouth, "and I'll stop." Carol opened her eyes, looked into his, saw desire, saw curiosity, saw something deeper, more dangerous. And she said nothing. He smiled, a small, slow, predatory smile, and finally closed the distance. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, as if he were memorizing her taste, the texture of her lips, the way she sighed softly when he deepened the contact. But then something changed. Gentleness gave way to urgency. His hands dropped to her waist, pulling her against him. She grabbed his shoulders, feeling the tense muscles under his shirt, and completely surrendered to that impossible moment. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Carol rested her forehead against his, eyes still closed, trying to process what had just happened. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, but his hands still held her waist, as if he couldn't let her go. "I know," she whispered back, "but now that you are, I don't know if I can let you go." Carol opened her eyes and found his. Those dark grey eyes that seemed to hold entire storms. The silence that settled between them wasn't empty. It was thick, loaded with unspoken promises and dangers not yet named. Carol felt Preston's hand slide slowly from her waist to her back, tracing an invisible line that sent shivers through every inch of her skin. She should be afraid. Should pull back, thank him politely, and disappear through the hallways like she always did. Invisible, untouched, safe. But safety was never what she truly wanted. Survival, yes. But desire? That was uncharted territory. Preston tilted his head, studying her with that unsettling intensity that seemed to pierce right through her. His dark grey eyes gleamed in the soft firelight, and Carol noticed something she hadn't before. There was loneliness in that gaze. A deep, ancient loneliness, hidden beneath layers of control and power. "You're trembling," he murmured, his voice low and rough. Carol hadn't even realized. Her hands were slightly shaky, and she hid them behind her back, embarrassed. "I'm not used to this." "To what?" Preston asked, pulling back just enough to face her directly, but without letting go completely. One of his hands still rested on the curve of her waist, warm and firm. "To someone touching you? Or to someone really seeing you?" The question disarmed her. Carol opened her mouth to respond, but the words got lost somewhere between fear and honesty. "Both," she finally admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Something changed in his face. The hardness softened. He raised his free hand and touched her face again, his thumb sliding slowly along the line of her jaw, down to her chin, as if drawing a map of territory he wanted to explore carefully. "Then I need to be careful with you," he said, more to himself than to her. Carol felt her heart race. There was something in the way he spoke, a mixture of desire and reverence, that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected. Preston took a step back and extended his hand. "Come with me." She looked at his hand, then at his face. She knew that if she accepted that invitation, she'd be crossing a line from which there'd be no return. But something stronger than fear, maybe curiosity, maybe the mirrored loneliness she recognized in him, made her place her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm and secure, and he guided her through the penthouse. They passed the minimalist living room, down the hallway with dark walls decorated with contemporary art, until they reached a bedroom that looked more like a work of architecture than a space for sleeping. The bed was enormous, covered in dark grey sheets that seemed too expensive to be touched. The walls were glass, once again offering that impossible view of Manhattan, now silent and asleep under the crescent moon. The city looked like an ocean of lights, and they were floating above it, isolated from the world. Carol stopped at the bedroom entrance, the weight of reality beginning to press on her chest. She'd never done this before, never allowed anyone to see her this way. She'd grown up in a world where vulnerability was synonymous with danger, where opening up meant getting hurt. Preston noticed her hesitation immediately. He released her hand, but didn't move away. Instead, he stood before her, waiting, not pressing, just present. "You can leave at any time," he said, his voice serious and controlled. "I won't stop you, and I won't judge you." Carol raised her eyes to his. There was sincerity there, and something more. He seemed to be fighting against his own desire, keeping himself in control for her sake. "I don't want to leave," she admitted, her voice coming out firmer than expected. He took a step forward. "Then tell me what you want." It was a simple question, but the answer was complex, woven through years of repression, self-imposed invisibility, never allowing anyone to get close enough to hurt her. "I want to feel alive," Carol whispered. And in saying it out loud, she realized it was the purest truth she'd ever told anyone. Preston closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing those words, allowing them to pass through him. When he opened them again, there was a different determination there, not brutal, not domineering, but deeply attentive. He approached slowly, giving her time to back away if she wanted. But she didn't back away. When he was inches away, he raised both hands and framed her face, tilting it slightly upward, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm going to make you feel alive," he promised, his voice rough and low. "But in my way, slowly, completely." Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to form words. The first kiss was gentle, almost reverent. His lips touched hers with a delicacy that completely contradicted the intensity of his gaze. He kissed her as if he had all the time in the world, as if there was nothing more important in the universe than that moment. Carol felt her legs weaken. She grabbed his shoulders to steady herself, and he pulled her closer, his hands sliding from her cheeks to her neck, then to her shoulders, slowly down her back. When the kiss deepened, she felt something crumble inside her. All the barriers she'd carefully built over the years began to crack, and for the first time, she allowed someone to break through them. Preston gently guided her to the bed, his hands never stopping touching her, on her face, her arms, her waist, as if he needed the constant connection to be sure she was there, real, present. He knelt before her, his eyes level with hers, and began to slowly unbutton the navy blue uniform she wore. Each button was undone with deliberate care, his fingers lightly grazing her skin with each movement. Carol felt her heart beating so hard, she was sure he could hear it. "Breathe," he murmured, noticing the tension in her body. She obeyed, breathing in deeply, and felt the air burn as it entered her lungs. When the uniform finally fell from her shoulders, Preston paused. His eyes traveled over her body, not with raw lust, but with something deeper. Admiration, curiosity, desire, yes, but wrapped in something that seemed almost reverent. "You're beautiful," he said, and it didn't sound like an empty compliment. It sounded like a statement of fact. Carol felt her cheeks warm. No one had ever called her beautiful before. No one had ever looked at her that way. She raised her hands and hesitantly began to unbutton his shirt. Her fingers trembled slightly, but he remained still, letting her explore at her own pace. When the shirt finally fell, revealing a defined and strong torso she couldn't help but touch, she ran her hands over his shoulders, slowly down his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the accelerated heartbeat under her palms. He gently held her wrists and brought them to his lips, kissing each one slowly. "You're afraid?" he observed. "Yes." "Of me?" "Of myself," she admitted. Preston released her wrists and framed her face again. "Don't be. I've got you." And then he kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. The urgency returned, but not aggressively. It was a shared urgency, a mutual need for connection, to be seen, to be real to each other. They lay down together, bodies intertwined, exploring each touch, each sigh, each tremor. Preston moved with an almost painful attention, watching each of her reactions, adjusting, making sure she was present, that she wanted this. And when they finally joined, Carol felt something inside her break and rebuild simultaneously. There was pain, a brief, sharp pain that was soon replaced by another sensation. Not just physical pleasure, but something deeper, connection, belonging. Preston stopped immediately when he felt the tension in her body. "Carol," he whispered, his eyes wide with understanding. "You've never—" She shook her head, unable to speak. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and Carol saw something change in him. The urgency disappeared completely, replaced by a devastating tenderness. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice heavy with something she couldn't identify. "Guilt? Protection? Both?" "Because I wanted this," she whispered. "I wanted you." He opened his eyes and looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. And then, with a gentleness that made her want to cry, he continued, slowly, carefully, attentive to every sigh, every movement, making sure the pain gave way to pleasure. And it did. When they finally finished, they remained intertwined, sweat mixing, breaths synchronized. Preston traced lazy circles on her back with his fingers, while she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat gradually calm down. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. "Yes," she replied, and it was true. He kissed the top of her head and pulled her closer, wrapping her completely in his arms. "You're mine now," he murmured against her hair. And although Carol knew she should question that statement, that she should fear that kind of possessiveness, she said nothing. Because in that moment, belonging to someone seemed less terrifying than continuing to be invisible. The days following that night turned into a strange fog for Carol. She continued her routine, woke up in the small apartment she shared with two other girls in the Bronx, took the subway to Manhattan, put on the navy blue uniform, and pushed the cleaning cart through the gleaming hallways of Blackwood Tower. Everything seemed the same, but nothing was, because now she felt eyes on her. They weren't the vague, indifferent glances of hurried executives or bored security guards. It was something different, something that made her stop in the middle of a hallway, heart racing, skin tingling, and look around expecting to find him, and she always did. Preston Blackwood had become a constant shadow in her life, not in an obvious or invasive way, but in subtle ways that left her restless and strangely warm. He appeared in the most unlikely places, in the basement cafeteria when she took her 3 a.m. break, in the parking lot when she finished her shift at dawn, in the 12th floor hallway when she was transporting trash bags, always silent, always watching. The first time she saw him after that night, Carol was cleaning the windows on the 22nd floor. It was a task that required concentration, balancing on the portable ladder, scrubbing the glass in wide circular motions, making sure not to leave streaks. She was so focused, she didn't notice his presence until she felt the air change. She turned abruptly and almost lost her balance. Preston was standing a few meters away, leaning against the wall, hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored dress pants, white shirt with sleeves rolled up revealing those strong forearms she could still feel around her when she closed her eyes. "Do you always work with such intensity?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. Carol stepped down from the ladder, her legs slightly shaky. She wiped her hands on her apron and tried to seem casual, but her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "It's my job," she replied, trying to sound professional. "Mr. Blackwood." He smiled slightly, that small, unsettling smile that completely transformed his face. "Preston," he corrected. "You know my name, Carol. Use it." The way he said her name, slowly savoring each syllable, did something strange to her stomach, a mixture of warmth and nervousness that left her not knowing how to react. "What are you doing here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He pushed off the wall and walked toward her with that natural confidence of someone who had always gotten everything he wanted. He stopped just inches away, close enough for her to smell the woody scent of his cologne mixed with the clean aroma of expensive soap. "I came to see you," he said simply. "Preston, we can't," she began, but he interrupted her by placing a finger lightly on her lips. "Shh, I didn't come to pressure you, I just needed to make sure you were real." Carol frowned, confused. "Real?" He lowered his hand, but didn't step back. "That night, all of it seemed too unlikely to be true." He paused, his dark grey eyes studying every detail of her face. "I can't stop thinking about you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her swallow hard. There was something in the way he looked at her, not as if she were a trophy to be won, but as if she were a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. "You should," Carol murmured. "Forget. Move on. That was a mistake." "Was it?" He tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I don't feel like it was. I feel like it was the most right thing I've ever done in my life." Carol felt the air leave her lungs. She knew she should back away, create distance, protect herself. But there was something in the raw vulnerability in his voice that kept her rooted in place. "Preston, we're from different worlds." "Then show me yours," he said without hesitation. "Because mine is empty without you." Before she could respond, he turned and left, leaving her alone in the silent hallway, heart beating irregularly, mind spinning in circles trying to understand what had just happened. But that was only the beginning. In the following days, Preston became a constant presence, not invasive but undeniable. He appeared when she least expected it, always with a plausible excuse, a meeting on the floor she was cleaning, a document he needed to retrieve personally, a coffee he decided to have in the empty cafeteria at dawn. But Carol knew the truth. He was there because of her. And the most disturbing part? She started waiting for those encounters. Started looking around, searching for him, feeling a strange mixture of disappointment and relief when she didn't find him. One night, she was cleaning the executive bathroom on the 35th floor, a task that always made her feel small, invisible, reduced to someone who exists only to serve. She was on her knees, scrubbing the marble floor, when she heard the door open. She looked up and found Preston standing in the doorway. This time, though, he didn't have his usual controlled posture. There was something different. His hair was more disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it several times. His tie was loose, and his eyes, and those dark grey eyes she was beginning to know so well, were loaded with something that seemed dangerously close to desperation. "Preston," she said, slowly standing up. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer immediately. He just walked toward her with long strides and pulled her into a tight embrace, wrapping her completely in his arms, his face buried in her hair. Carol stood motionless for a moment, surprised, but then felt his body trembling slightly against hers. He was holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a crumbling world. "Preston," she whispered, hesitantly wrapping her arms around him. "What happened?" He took a deep breath, inhaling her scent, a mixture of cheap soap and cleaning products. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out rough and low. "I had a meeting today. With my father. He wants me to marry the daughter of one of our investors. A strategic alliance." He let out a bitter laugh, as if I were a chess piece to be moved. Carol felt her chest tighten. She knew his world worked that way: arranged marriages, business alliances, cold and calculated strategies. But hearing it out loud made everything painfully real. Maybe it's what's best for you," she said, though the words came out forced. Preston pulled back abruptly and held her face with both hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Don't say that," he said, his voice firm and intense. "Don't say it would be better if I married someone who means nothing to me when the only person who makes me feel something real is right here in front of me. Preston, don't run from me, Carol." He slid his thumb across her face, wiping away a tear she hadn't even realized had escaped. "You know this is real. You feel what I feel. I see it in your eyes every time I look at you." And it was true. Carol knew. She felt the connection between them growing, intensifying, becoming something impossible to ignore. It was as if their bodies spoke a language their minds were still trying to deny. "But we can't," she began, but he silenced her with a kiss. It wasn't gentle like the first time. It was urgent, almost desperate, loaded with need and frustration and something deeper that neither was ready to name. He pressed her against the cold marble wall, hands tangled in her hair, body pressed against hers, as if he couldn't bear any space between them. Carol surrendered completely, her hands moving up his shoulders, pulling him closer, responding with the same intensity. She could feel his heart beating irregularly against hers, could feel the tremor in his hands, could feel the desire exploding between them like an impossible force to contain. When they finally separated, both were breathless. Preston rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, trying to regain control. "I'm obsessed with you," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I can't work. I can't sleep. I can't think about anything but you, your smile, your voice, the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating." He opened his eyes and looked at her with an intensity that made her tremble. "You've driven me crazy, Carol Hayes." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. "This can't work. You know that." "I don't care," he said without hesitation. "Let chaos come. Let the fall come. I'd rather risk everything with you than keep living this empty life without you." Carol felt something break inside her. All the defenses she'd built, all the walls she'd erected to protect herself, began to crumble in the face of that raw and honest declaration. "Preston, I can't stop thinking about you either," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, not that small, controlled smile, but a genuine smile that completely lit up his face. "Then stop fighting it," he said, holding her hands and intertwining their fingers. "Stop running. Let this happen." Carol looked at their intertwined hands, hers small and calloused, his large and strong, and for the first time allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this could be more than one impossible night. "I'm afraid," she confessed. "So am I," he admitted. "But I'm more afraid of losing you." They stood there, still in the empty executive bathroom, lit only by the cold light from the hallway, holding on to each other as if they were the only real thing in a world of illusions. And although Carol knew there were storms ahead, that their world wouldn't allow this union easily, in that moment she chose to believe that love, or whatever this magnetic force between them was, could be stronger than any obstacle. "Tomorrow night," Preston said softly. "Have dinner with me. Really. Not hidden, not rushed. Just the two of us." Carol hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Okay." He smiled again and kissed her forehead with devastating tenderness. "Until tomorrow, then." And when he left, Carol remained there, heart racing, lips still tingling with the taste of him, knowing she had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. But this time she didn't want to go back. The dinner never happened. The next night, when Carol was supposed to meet Preston, she received a message from him cancelling. Brief, without detailed explanations. Something urgent came up. "I'm sorry. I'll explain soon." The words were cold, distant, so different from the man who had held her against the bathroom wall and confessed to being obsessed with her. Carol tried not to let disappointment consume her. After all, she knew his world. Last-minute meetings, corporate emergencies, obligations she would never fully understand. But still, something inside her contracted painfully as she read that message. She put her phone in her uniform pocket and went back to work, pushing the cart through the empty hallways of Blackwood Tower with renewed determination to keep her mind occupied. It was almost 2 in the morning when Carol reached the 40th floor, an area that rarely needed cleaning as it housed only old file rooms and deactivated offices. Most companies had already migrated everything to digital systems, but Blackwood kept those spaces as if they were relics of a past they weren't ready to abandon yet. Carol pushed open the door to one of the rooms at the end of the hallway. The smell of old, musty paper immediately invaded her nostrils. Rusty metal shelves occupied almost the entire space, loaded with brown cardboard boxes covered in a thick layer of dust. The fluorescent light flickered a few times before stabilizing, casting a pale, ghostly glow over everything. She sighed and began to work, cleaning the shelves, organizing boxes that had fallen, wiping down forgotten furniture. It was mechanical work, almost meditative, that normally calmed her, but that night her mind kept returning to Preston. Why did he cancel? Did he regret it? Did he realize how absurd this whole situation was? Carol shook her head, trying to push away the intrusive thoughts. She was wiping down a high shelf when her hand accidentally knocked into a poorly positioned box. It fell to the floor with a dull thud, and dozens of folders and documents scattered across the dusty floor. "Damn it," she muttered, kneeling down to pick up the mess. That's when she saw it. An old folder made of worn leather, with gold letters almost faded by time. "St. Catherine's Home for Children. Confidential." Carol froze. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the folder. St. Catherine's. She knew that name, knew it intimately. It was the orphanage where she'd grown up, a cold institutional place in the suburbs of New Jersey where children were just numbers, records on administrative spreadsheets. With her heart racing, she opened the folder. What she found inside made her blood run cold. Documents, dozens of them. Medical reports, transfer records, authorization forms signed by names she didn't recognize. But they weren't common adoption or foster care records. They were something else. Project Aurora, experimental phase. Subject 47, transferred to secondary facility. Authorization for psychological testing on minors in state custody. Funding approved by the Blackwood Foundation. Carol felt nausea rise in her throat. Her hands were shaking so much she almost dropped the papers again. She kept flipping through, each page revealing horrors greater than the last. Old black and white photographs showed children lined up, all wearing identical uniforms, empty gazes fixed on the camera. There were tables with names, ages, and next to each one, codes, identification numbers, as if they were experiments, not people. And then she saw it. In the corner of one of the pages, attached by a rusty paper clip, there was a child's drawing, made with crayons on paper yellowed by time. It was a simple drawing, a house, a sun, a tree, and in the lower right corner, in shaky, clumsy letters, a name, Carol. She let out a strangled gasp. She held the drawing with both hands, eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She remembered making that drawing. She was 5, maybe 6 years old. She remembered the social worker smiling forcedly and saying she could draw anything she wanted. "Something that makes you happy, dear." Carol had drawn a house, because she'd never had one. She turned to the next page and found her complete record. Name: Carol Ann Hayes. Date of birth: March 12, 2002. Status: orphan, parents unknown. Entry to St. Catherine's, August 2005. Transfer, March 2008. Undisclosed facility notes. Subject: demonstrates above average emotional resilience. Suitable for Phase 2 of Project Aurora. Carol read and reread those words, trying to process what they meant. Phase 2, undisclosed facility. She vaguely remembered being transferred when she was 6. She remembered a different place, colder, quieter, where children rarely talked to each other. But her memories of that period were fragmented, as if her brain had deliberately buried those years. She continued flipping frantically, looking for more information, and that's when she found the name that made everything collapse. At the top of an official document, printed on elegant letterhead, was written, "Blackwood Foundation, Annual Report of Philanthropic Activities," and right below in smaller letters, "Full funding of St. Catherine's Home for Children and associated child development programs." Signed by Harrison Blackwood, Preston's father. Carol felt the ground shift beneath her. The walls of the small archive seemed to close in, suffocating her. She dropped the papers and brought her hands to her face, trying to breathe, but the air seemed insufficient. The Blackwood family had funded the orphanage. Not just that, they had used the children for some kind of experiment. And she was one of them. One of the children used, tested, transferred without a trace. "No, no, no," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. That's when she heard the door open behind her. Carol turned abruptly, still kneeling on the floor surrounded by scattered documents, and found Preston standing in the doorway. He was wearing the same clothes from the meeting, impeccable dark suit, perfectly adjusted tie, but there was something different about his face. Exhaustion, tension, and when his eyes landed on the papers around her, something that looked dangerously close to fear. "Carol," he began, taking a step forward. "Don't come closer," she said, her voice coming out firmer than expected, though she was trembling completely. Preston stopped immediately. His eyes scanned the documents on the floor, and she saw the exact moment he recognized what they were. The color drained from his face. "Did you know?" Carol asked, her voice breaking. "Did you know what your family did?" He ran his hand through his hair, clearly disturbed. "No, not like this. I knew my father funded orphanages, but I thought it was real philanthropy. They took me from there," Carol interrupted, holding up the child's drawing with trembling hands. "I was one of the children in the project that your family erased from the map." Preston took another step but stopped when he saw the way she instinctively recoiled. "Carol, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" She stood up abruptly, papers falling from her hands. "That your family used me as a guinea pig. That I wasn't a person, just a number on a spreadsheet. That everything I went through, all the pain, all the loneliness, was because someone decided that children like me were disposable." "No," Preston said firmly, approaching despite her warning. "You were never disposable. Never." "How can you say that?" Carol shouted, tears finally escaping. "Look at this. Look at what they did. Your family, your blood, built this empire on the backs of broken children." Preston was in front of her now, so close she could see the raw pain in his eyes. "I didn't know," he repeated, his voice hoarse. "I swear on everything I have, Carol. I didn't know. But now that I do," he paused, his jaw tensing, "I'm going to destroy all of it. Every part of this disgusting legacy my father built." Carol shook her head, more tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand. I should hate you. I should hate you for everything your family represents, but—" Her voice failed, and she covered her face with her hands. "But every time you touch me, I forget who I am. I forget where I came from. And that terrifies me." Preston gently framed her face with his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Then hate me," he said quietly. "Scream at me, hit me, do whatever you need to do. But don't pull away. Please, don't pull away from me." Carol held his wrists, but didn't push him away. She just stood there, caught between anger and desire, between the past that haunted her and the impossible present unfolding before her. "Why did it have to be you?" she whispered, her voice broken. "Of all the people in the world, why did it have to be you?" "I don't know," Preston answered honestly, resting his forehead against hers. "But maybe that's exactly why. Maybe I need to be the one who fixes what my family broke." They remained like that for a long moment. Breaths mingled, tears shared, two souls caught in an inevitable collision between past and present. And when Preston pulled her into a tight embrace, Carol didn't resist. She just allowed herself to be held, just for a moment, before the cruel reality of it all came crashing back down on them. "We shouldn't be together," she murmured against his chest. "I know," he replied, holding her tighter. "This is going to destroy us." "Probably." She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Then why won't you let me go?" Preston held her face again, his thumb wiping away the tears that were still falling. "Because maybe some things are worth being destroyed for." And when he kissed her, slowly, painfully tender, Carol knew that no matter how wrong this was, no matter how many reasons there were to walk away, she was already lost in him. Completely, irrevocably, dangerously lost. The days following that devastating discovery were strange and tense. Carol continued working at Blackwood Tower because she needed the money, because she had nowhere else to go, and maybe secretly because she couldn't completely pull away from Preston, no matter how much she knew she should. He didn't pressure her, didn't appear in every hallway like he used to. He respected the space she needed to process everything. But he sent messages. Small, simple, honest ones. "Did you eat something today? Are you able to sleep? I'm here if you need me." Carol read each one late at night, when she returned to the small apartment in the Bronx and lay alone on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. And although she didn't respond immediately, she kept those words like small treasures, reminders that, despite everything, there was someone who cared. But the anger was still there, burning quietly, constantly, like embers that refused to go out. Not anger at him specifically, but at what he represented. At the legacy he carried without choice, at the cruel injustice of falling in love with exactly the person who should be her enemy. It was on a Friday, almost a week after discovering the files, that everything changed again. Carol was on the terrace of the 40th floor, an outdoor area rarely used, with a panoramic view of the Hudson River. It was almost dawn, and she'd gone up to breathe fresh air before finishing her shift. The cold October wind blew strongly, tousling her hair, and she closed her eyes, allowing herself to just feel for a moment. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found Preston standing in the terrace doorway. He wore dark jeans and a leather jacket, casual clothes that made him look younger, more accessible, less the ruthless air and more just. A man. There were dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't been sleeping well either. "I thought I'd find you here," he said quietly, hands in his pockets. "How did you know?" Carol asked, turning back to the view. "Because I know you," he replied simply, approaching slowly. "You always come to high places when you need to think. Like being closer to the sky gives you perspective." Carol didn't respond, but felt something tighten in her chest. It was unsettling how deeply he already knew her in such a short time. Preston stopped beside her, keeping a respectful distance, both looking at the city beginning to wake. The first lights of dawn painted the horizon in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, everything seemed suspended, peaceful even. "I hired investigators," Preston said, finally breaking the silence. "Private ones, the best, to find out everything about Project Aurora." Carol turned abruptly to face him. "Why?" "Because you deserve answers," he said, meeting her eyes. "And because my father needs to pay for what he did." "Preston," she began, but he gently interrupted. "I'm not going to let this slide, Carol. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen just because it's convenient for me or for the company. You..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You made me question everything I learned. Everything I thought I knew about honor, loyalty, family. And I realized none of it matters if it's built on the suffering of innocent people. The wind blew stronger, and Carol felt her hair fly around her face. Preston instinctively reached out and brushed it away gently, tucking the strands behind her ear. His fingers lingered there, lightly grazing her skin, and Carol closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel that touch. "I should hate you," she whispered, slowly opening her eyes. "I know," he replied, his voice rough, "but I can't." Preston took a step closer, eliminating almost all the space between them. Their breaths mingled in the cold morning air. "Why not?" he asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. Carol raised her hand and touched his face hesitantly, first just with her fingertips, then with her entire palm, feeling the slightly grown stubble, the warmth of his skin. "Because when I'm with you, I don't feel invisible," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "For the first time in my life, someone sees me, really sees me. And I don't know how to go back to being invisible after that." Something broke in his face. All the restraint, all the control he maintained so carefully, crumbled. He held her face with both hands and pulled her into a kiss. But it wasn't urgent or desperate like the previous ones. It was slow, deep, loaded with something greater than desire. It was a kiss of surrender, of acceptance, of a conscious choice to dive into something they both knew could destroy them. When they separated, Preston rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, breathing irregular. "I see you, Carol," he whispered. "I see every part of you, the scars, the strength, the fear you hide behind courage. I see everything. And I want everything." Carol felt tears rising again, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from something more complicated, a mixture of relief, fear, hope, and surrender. "This isn't going to be easy," she said quietly. "Nothing worthwhile is," he replied, opening his eyes to meet hers. "Your father is going to destroy us when he finds out." "Then let him find out," Preston said without hesitation. "I'm not going to give you up to protect a legacy I don't want. I won't sacrifice the only real thing I've ever had for a name stained with blood." Carol held his wrists, keeping his hands on her face. "What if I'm not strong enough for this, for all the fighting that's coming?" Preston smiled. Not that small, controlled smile, but a genuine, tender smile. "You survived things that would destroy most people. You grew up alone, without help, without anyone believing in you. If anyone's strong enough for this, Carol, it's you." The words pierced through her like well-aimed arrows. No one had ever believed in her that way. No one had ever seen her strength and validated it out loud. "I'm afraid," she confessed once more. "So am I," he admitted. "But I'm more afraid of living without you than of facing any storm by your side." Carol didn't respond with words. Instead, she pulled him into another kiss. This time she was taking the initiative. She was choosing this consciously. Her arms wrapped around his neck and he pulled her by the waist, lifting her slightly off the ground as he deepened the kiss. There on the terrace of the 40th floor, while the city woke below them and the sun rose painting everything golden, Preston and Carol made a silent choice. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be safe, but it would be real. And maybe in the end, that was enough. When they finally separated, breathless and smiling, Preston held her hand and intertwined their fingers. "Come with me," he said. "Where?" "Anywhere, everywhere." He squeezed her hand gently. "Just stay with me." Carol looked at their intertwined fingers, so different but fitting together perfectly, and nodded. "Okay." They stayed there for a few more minutes, just holding each other, watching the city wake up. The wind kept blowing strong, but now Carol didn't feel cold anymore. She felt warm, protected, seen. "My father is coming back from a business trip tonight," Preston said eventually, his voice more serious. "I'm going to confront him about the files, about everything." Carol tensed. "Hi, Preston, maybe it's not the right time." "It's exactly the right time," he interrupted, turning to face her completely. "I'm not going to keep living a lie. I'm not going to pretend everything's okay when it's not. And I'm not going to hide you like you're something I'm ashamed of. I don't want to cause a war between you and your family." "You're not causing anything," he said firmly. "They caused it, decades ago. And it's time someone finally holds them accountable." Carol studied his face, The determination in his tense jaw, the fire in his dark grey eyes, the way he held her hand as if she were his anchor. "What if you lose everything?" she asked quietly. "The company, the name, the fortune, everything." Preston held her face again, forcing her to maintain eye contact. "Then I lose," he said simply. "But I'd rather lose everything and have you than keep everything and live empty." And in that moment, under the golden light of dawn, with the wind blowing around them and the city pulsing below, Carol finally allowed herself to believe that maybe love, or whatever this magnetic force between them was, could be stronger than the past, stronger than legacy, stronger than fear. "Together then," she whispered. Preston smiled and pulled her into one more kiss, gentle, promising, loaded with everything still to come. "Together," he echoed against her lips. And although neither knew exactly what the future held, in that moment they chose to face it side by side, whatever it might be. In the weeks following that dawn on the terrace, Preston and Carol created a world of their own, made of stolen moments, secret glances, and touches that spoke more than 1,000 words. It was a romance built in the shadows, in the empty spaces between day and night, where no one saw them and nothing mattered beyond the two of them. Blackwood Tower became their secret refuge, a labyrinth of silent hallways, private elevators, and forgotten rooms where they could exist together without judgment, without the weight of the real world pressing on their shoulders. Preston learned Carol's routine by heart. He knew exactly where she'd be at every hour of the early morning. He knew the floors she cleaned, the times of her breaks, even the way she wrinkled her nose when she found a particularly stubborn stain. And she in turn began to notice his patterns, the nights he stayed late at the office, the way he ran his hand through his hair when he was stressed, the way his eyes searched for her even during important meetings. They communicated through silences, loaded with meaning. One night, Carol was cleaning the windows on the 19th floor when she felt his presence. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Preston. Her body already recognized the way the air changed when he entered a space. A subtle electricity, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She continued working, pretending not to notice, but a small smile played on her lips. "You're going to pretend you didn't see me?" His voice came low and amused, echoing through the empty hallway. "I'm working," Carol replied without looking back, wiping the cloth in circular motions on the glass. She heard him approach, slow, measured, deliberate steps, and then she felt his warmth at her back, so close she could feel his breath brushing the nape of her neck. "You always say that," Preston murmured, his hands gently resting on her waist. "But you never send me away." Carol closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel that touch before slowly turning to face him. He was wearing his shirt slightly open at the collar, tie loose, hair messy from a long day of work. But it was the look in his eyes that completely disarmed her, that mixture of desire, tenderness, and something deeper that neither dared to name yet. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, but her hands were already instinctively moving up to his shoulders. "Probably not," he agreed, leaning in until their faces were inches apart. "But I can't stay away from you." And then he kissed her, slowly, savoring, as if they had all the time in the world, though both knew they didn't. The kiss started gentle, almost reverent, but soon deepened. His hands slid from her waist to her back, pulling her closer, while she intertwined her fingers in his hair, pulling him down. When they finally separated, both were breathless. "This is crazy," Carol whispered against his lips. "The best kind of crazy I've ever lived," he replied, kissing her forehead, then each cheek, then the corner of her mouth. In the following days, those encounters became more frequent, more intense, more necessary. Preston found her in the elevator at 3 in the morning. The doors would close, and for those brief seconds of ascent or descent, they existed in a world where nothing else mattered. He pressed her against the elevator wall, hands tangled in her hair, lips exploring her neck while she held his shoulders, trying to contain the sighs that threatened to escape. "You drive me crazy," he murmured against her skin, his voice hoarse with contained desire. "Good," she replied, smiling against his lips. "Then we're even." Another night, Carol was organizing supplies in a small storage room on the 23rd floor when Preston entered silently, closing the door behind him with a soft click. She turned, her heart immediately racing. "You're going to make me lose my job," she said, but there was no real reproach in her voice, just that playful tone he'd learned to love. "Then I'll hire you for something else," he replied, approaching with that confident stride that always made her tremble slightly. "Oh, yeah? For what?" Preston stopped in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "To be mine," he said simply, without beating around the bush. The air between them became dense, loaded with everything they felt and couldn't fully express in words. Carol grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him down until their lips met. The kiss was different this time, urgent, almost desperate, as if both were trying to make up for all the time they spent apart. His hands descended down the side of her body, exploring every curve, while she slowly unbuttoned the first buttons of his shirt, feeling the warm skin under her palms. "Carol," he moaned softly when her lips descended down his neck, kissing, gently nibbling. She murmured against his skin, feeling the accelerated pulse under her lips. "If we don't stop now," he began, but his voice failed when she gently bit his earlobe. "Then don't stop," she whispered. Preston groaned again and pulled her abruptly, turning her and pressing her against the wall. His hands held her wrists above her head with just one hand, while the other slowly slid down the side of her body, leaving a trail of fire wherever it passed. "You don't know what you do to me," he murmured against her ear, his voice rough and low. "I spend all day thinking about you, about how you smile when you think no one's watching, about how your skin gets goosebumps when I touch you here." His fingers brushed her neck, and she shivered involuntarily. "And here," he descended to her collarbone, "and especially here." His hand rested on her waist, his thumb tracing slow circles that made her completely lose her breath. Carol pulled her wrists, and he released her immediately, always giving her the freedom to choose. She held his face with both hands and pulled him into a deep kiss, completely surrendering to that stolen moment. They didn't go beyond that night. They knew it was too risky there. But they remained together for long minutes, just touching, kissing, murmuring low words loaded with promises. Another encounter happened in an empty conference room on the 35th floor. It was almost dawn, and Carol had gone to clean the tables after an executive meeting that had ended late. Preston entered silently, locking the door behind him. She saw him in the reflection of the glass windows and smiled. "Are you following me, Mr. Blackwood?" "Always," he replied without hesitation, approaching from behind and wrapping her in his arms. Carol turned within the embrace, facing him. There was something different about him that night, a vulnerability he rarely showed. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly, touching his face. Preston closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I had another argument with my father today about you." Carol tensed. "Preston?" "He found out," Preston interrupted, opening his eyes to meet hers. "Not everything, but he knows I'm seeing someone, and he's furious because it's not the woman he chose for me." "Maybe he's right," Carol said quietly, though each word hurt. "Maybe I'm not the right person for you." Preston held her face firmly, forcing her to maintain eye contact. "You're the only right person for me," he said with intensity, "and I'm not going to let him decide who I can or can't love." The word hung in the air between them. Love. Neither had said it before, not directly. Carol felt tears threaten to escape. "Preston, I love you, Carol," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, only absolute certainty. "I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe that first night. Maybe when you looked at me with those defiant eyes and refused to bow. Maybe it was over every stolen moment we spent together. But I love you completely, irrevocably." A tear rolled down her face, and he wiped it away with his thumb. "You don't have to say it back," he continued. "I just needed you to know. Because no matter what happens, I choose you, I'll always choose you." Carol couldn't speak. The words were stuck somewhere between fear and hope. So she did the only thing she could, pulled him into a kiss that said everything her voice couldn't. "I love you too, I choose you too. I'm afraid too, but I can't stop." They kissed slowly, deeply, as if sealing a silent promise. His hands slid down her back, pulling her impossibly closer. She held his face, memorizing every detail, the texture of his beard, the warmth of his skin, the taste of his lips. When they finally separated, Preston rested his forehead against hers, both breathing heavily. "Run away with me," he whispered. Carol opened her eyes, confused. "What?" "Run away with me. Today. Now." He pulled back just enough to face her completely. "Let's go somewhere where no one knows us, where we can just be the two of us, without last names, without pasts, without expectations." Carol wanted to say yes. Every cell in her body screamed to accept, to run, to build a new life away from all of this. But she also knew they couldn't run forever. "Preston," she began gently, "we can't run from our problems. They'll follow us wherever we go." He closed his eyes, knowing she was right, but clearly hating to admit it. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice loaded with frustration and desire. Carol held his hands, intertwining their fingers. "We face it," she said with a determination that surprised even herself. "Together. You're not alone in this, Preston. Not anymore." He opened his eyes and looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "How can you be so strong?" "Because you made me believe I can be," she replied simply. Preston pulled her into another tight embrace, burying his face in her hair. "I'm not going to lose you," he murmured. "No matter what my father does, no matter how many obstacles appear, I'm not going to lose you." "Then don't let me go," Carol whispered back. And there, in the empty conference room while the city woke outside, they held on to each other. Two hearts beating in sync, two souls fighting against the world, two people choosing love, even knowing the path ahead would be filled with storms. But storms never scared those who had already survived hell, and both had already survived. The following weeks brought a growing tension that neither could completely ignore, even in the most intimate moments. The outside world was beginning to invade the refuge they'd built together, and both felt the walls closing in around them. For Carol, the nights became a battlefield between what she felt and what she knew to be true. She found herself waking at 3 in the morning, sweaty and breathless, fleeing from fragmented nightmares, buried memories of the orphanage that now returned with full force, blurred faces of other children, white, cold hallways, adult voices talking about them as if they were objects, not people, and always at the bottom of each memory that name, Blackwood. It was like loving the fire that burned down your house, like embracing the storm that destroyed everything you knew. And although Preston wasn't guilty of his father's crimes, he carried that last name, that legacy, that blood. One night after another stolen encounter, this time on the terrace where everything had changed between them, Carol abruptly pulled away from Preston in the middle of a kiss. He looked at her, confused and worried. "What's wrong?" Carol took a few steps back, running her hands through her hair in a gesture of frustration. "I can't do this," she said, her voice trembling. "Do what?" Preston took a step toward her, but stopped when he saw the way she recoiled. "This, us," she pointed between the two of them, tears already beginning to form. "You're part of what destroyed my childhood, Preston. Every time I kiss you, every time I allow myself to feel something for you, it's like betraying the child I was. That girl who suffered at your family's hands." The words came out like sharp knives, and Carol saw their impact on his face, but she couldn't stop. "I wake up every night, remembering things I spent years trying to forget. And now I know all of that happened because someone with your last name decided that children like me were disposable. How can I just forget that?" Preston remained motionless, jaw tensed, eyes fixed on her. When he finally spoke, his voice came out low and controlled but loaded with pain. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't hate myself every day for carrying this name?" He took a step forward, ignoring her retreat. "I spent my entire life trying to prove I was more than Harrison Blackwood's son, that I could build something different, something better. But every time I look in the mirror, I see his face. Every time I sign a document, I see that cursed last name." He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the raw pain in his eyes. "But then I met you. And for the first time in my life, I thought I could be more than that. That I could just be Preston. Not the heir, not the monster's son, just me." His voice faltered slightly. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe I can never escape what he did." Carol felt her chest tighten painfully. She wanted to comfort him, wanted to hold his face and say he was wrong, that he was more than that. But the words stuck in her throat, blocked by years of pain and anger that didn't know where to go. "I don't know how to move forward," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to love you without betraying myself." Preston closed his eyes, breathing deeply. When he opened them again, there was a fierce determination there. "Then don't love me," he said, and the words shocked her. "If that's what you need to do to have peace, then don't love me. Hate me, blame me, do whatever's necessary." He took another step, completely eliminating the space between them, and held her face with both hands, not possessively, but with devastating gentleness. "But don't pull away," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Hate me, blame me, make me pay for my father's sins. But don't disappear from my life, because I don't know how to exist without you anymore." A tear rolled down Carol's face, followed by another until she was crying openly. Years of pain, confusion, and impossible love pouring out all at once. "I don't hate you," she sobbed. "That's the problem. I should, but I can't. And that scares me more than anything." Preston pulled her into his arms, wrapping her completely, and she allowed herself to crumble there, safe, protected, seen. "I'm afraid too," he murmured against her hair. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of not being enough. Afraid that my past will hurt you so much you won't be able to look at me anymore." They remained like that for long minutes, holding each other while the cold night wind blew around them. Two broken hearts trying to heal through the only thing they seemed to have: each other. Eventually, Carol pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "I need time," she said quietly. "Not to decide if I want you. I already know I do. But to process all of this. To find a way to love you without losing myself in the process." Preston nodded, though the pain was evident on his face. "How much time do you need?" "I don't know," she admitted honestly. He kissed her forehead, then each cheek where tears had fallen, and finally her lips, gentle, tender, loaded with everything they felt. "I'll wait," he promised. "However long it takes, because you're worth every second." In the following days, Carol kept her distance, didn't respond to his messages immediately, avoided the places where she knew he'd be. She needed that space to breathe, to think, to try to understand who she was outside of Preston Blackwood's magnetic orbit. But his absence hurt in ways she didn't expect. It was as if a part of her had been torn away, leaving an emptiness that nothing else could fill. Meanwhile, Preston was fighting his own battle. Harrison Blackwood had called a formal meeting, something that rarely happened. And when Preston entered the luxurious office on the 45th floor, he found his father sitting behind the solid mahogany desk, cold, calculating eyes studying him as if he were a business adversary, not his son. "Sit down," Harrison ordered, his voice deep and authoritative. Preston remained standing. "I'd rather not." A cold smile touched Harrison's lips. "Always so stubborn, just like your mother." "Don't mention my mother," Preston said, his voice low and dangerous. Harrison ignored the comment and opened a folder on the desk, pushing it toward Preston. "Private investigators are expensive, my son, but effective." Preston felt his blood run cold. He walked to the desk and looked at the folder. Inside were photographs of him and Carol on the terrace, in the elevator, in the conference room, all taken from discreet, invasive, violating angles. "You had me followed," Preston said, his voice loaded with contained anger. "I protected my legacy," Harrison corrected, "and I discovered that my only son is getting involved with—" He paused, contempt evident in his voice. "A cleaning lady, an orphan, someone absolutely unsuitable to carry the Blackwood name." Preston closed the folder forcefully, fists clenched. "Be careful what you say about her." "Or what?" Harrison stood facing his son. "You'll threaten me? Renounce the empire I built? For a girl who means nothing?" "She means everything," Preston roared, completely losing control. "And you have no right to judge her, not after what you did." Harrison frowned. "What are you talking about?" "About Project Aurora." Preston spat the words. "About the children you used as guinea pigs. About the orphanages you funded not out of charity, but to have access to vulnerable children no one would look for." Harrison's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Preston said, approaching the desk, and Carol was one of them. one of the children you destroyed. So before you judge who she is or whether she's suitable, remember that you're the reason she grew up alone, scared, and invisible. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Finally, Harrison sat down again, expression impassive. You're emotionally compromised. You can't see clearly. For the first time in my life, I'm seeing perfectly, Preston replied. And what I see is a man who built an empire on the suffering of innocence. A man who never loved anything but power. A man I don't want to become. Harrison studied him for a long moment. If you continue with this, I'll disinherit you, cut you off completely. You'll have nothing. Preston smiled, a bitter, liberating smile. Good, because I don't want anything that comes stained with the blood of innocent children. He turned to leave, but Harrison's voice stopped him. She's going to destroy you, Preston. That kind of love always destroys. Preston looked over his shoulder. Then let it destroy me. At least I'll feel something real before I fall. And he left, leaving Harrison alone in his office full of empty trophies and hollow victories. That night, Preston went to Carol's apartment in the Bronx, something she'd never allowed before. He climbed the 5 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken, walked through the poorly lit hallways, and stopped in front of door number 43. He knocked softly. Carol opened it, surprised and visibly exhausted. She wore simple house clothes, hair loose and messy, no makeup, and to Preston she'd never looked more beautiful. "Preston? What are you doing here?" "Choosing you," he said simply. "My father gave me an ultimatum today. Either I leave you and marry whoever he chooses, or he disinherits me completely." Carol's eyes widened. "Preston, I chose you," he interrupted, taking a step forward. "Without hesitating, without doubts. I choose you, Carol. I'll always choose you." Tears began to fall down her face again. "But you're going to lose everything." "No," he said, gently holding her face. "I'm going to gain the only thing that matters. You." And then he kissed her. Slow, firm, present, a kiss that sealed an unshakable promise. When they separated, Carol was crying but also smiling. "I love you," she finally said out loud. "I love you, Preston, and I'm so afraid of it. But I can't stop." "Then don't stop," he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. "Be afraid, fight, question, but don't stop loving me, because I'll be here every day showing you that you deserve to be loved, that you deserve to be seen, that you deserve everything." They remained there in the narrow, poorly lit hallway, holding each other while the world crumbled around them. But for the first time, neither was running. They were facing it, together. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to survive what was coming. After that confession in the narrow hallway of her apartment, something changed definitively between them. It was no longer a stolen romance, built in the shadows and fed by furtive encounters. It was a conscious choice, a decision to face the world together, whatever the cost. Carol invited Preston inside for the first time. The apartment was tiny, a room that served as bedroom, kitchen, and living area all at once. The walls had peeling paint, the sofa was second-hand, and there was only one small window that looked out onto the back alley. It was a completely different world from the penthouse of glass and marble where they'd met. But Preston showed no judgment. He just looked around with genuine curiosity, as if being introduced to an essential part of Carol he didn't yet know. "It's small," she said, a bit embarrassed, closing the door behind them. "It's yours," he replied simply, turning to face her. "And that makes it perfect." Carol felt her chest warm. No one had ever looked at her life with that complete absence of judgment. To Preston, it didn't matter where she lived or what she owned. What mattered was only who she was. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. Two hearts beating in sync, two souls that had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. Preston took the first step, approaching slowly. His hands found her waist, pulling her gently close. Carol raised her arms and wrapped them around his neck, intertwining her fingers in his hair. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his dark grey eyes studying every feature of her face. "About us. About this. Because once I have you completely, Carol, I won't be able to let you go." She smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I'm already yours. she whispered. "I think I always was, from that first night. I was just too afraid to admit it." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing those words, letting them penetrate deeply. When he opened them again, there was an intensity there that made her tremble. "Then today isn't about fear," he said, his voice rough and low. "Today is about choice, about surrender, about allowing ourselves to be completely vulnerable with each other." Carol nodded, unable to form words. Instead, she pulled him into a kiss, slow at first, exploratory, but soon deepening into something more urgent, more necessary. His hands slid from her back to the hem of her simple shirt, and he paused, his eyes meeting hers in a silent question. She nodded, and he lifted the shirt slowly, revealing pale skin marked by small scars, stories of a difficult life written on her body. Preston traced each mark with his fingers, then with his lips, kissing each scar as if healing old wounds. "You're beautiful," he murmured against her skin. "Every part of you, every mark, every story." Carol felt tears threaten to escape, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from relief, from being seen completely, imperfections and all, and still being desired. She began to unbutton his shirt, this time without the desperate urgency of previous encounters. Each button was undone carefully, as if she were revealing something sacred. When the shirt finally fell, she ran her hands over his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the strong beating of his heart under her palms. "I never imagined I could have this," she confessed quietly, her eyes fixed on her hands on his chest. "Someone who would choose me, who would see me, who would stay." Preston held her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. "Not now, not tomorrow, not ever. You're stuck with me, Carol Hayes." She smiled through tears and pulled him into another kiss. This one deeper, truer, loaded with everything they felt, and finally allowed themselves to express. They moved together toward the narrow bed in the corner of the room. Preston laid her down gently, as if she were something precious and fragile, though they both knew she was anything but fragile. Carol was made of survival, of strength forged in fire. But in that moment, she allowed herself to be soft, to be vulnerable, to be herself without armor. He lay beside her, propped on one elbow, and just watched her for a long moment. His fingers traced the outline of her face, the line of her jaw, the arch of her eyebrows, the curve of her lips. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly, smiling. "Memorizing," he replied simply. "Every detail, every angle, because I want to remember this moment for the rest of my life." Carol felt her heart squeeze in a good way, a sweet way. She raised her hand and mirrored his gesture, tracing his face with her fingertips, the strong line of his jaw, the dark eyebrows, the lips she'd learned to know so well. "Me too," she whispered. Preston leaned in and kissed her again, and this time there was no rush, no desperate urgency or fear of being discovered. It was just the two of them, choosing to be together, choosing to surrender completely. His hands slid over her body with reverence, exploring every curve, every line, as if learning a new language. And Carol responded the same way, her hands exploring his broad shoulders, muscular back, feeling every tense muscle under her palm. When they finally undressed completely, there was no shame, only acceptance, admiration, love. Preston kissed her slowly, descending down her neck, her collarbone, her breasts, her stomach, leaving a trail of kisses that made her tremble beneath him. Carol intertwined her fingers in his hair, eyes closed, allowing herself to just feel. "Preston," she sighed, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. He returned to kiss her lips, positioning himself between her legs, but paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, always attentive, always making sure. "Yes," she replied, pulling him closer. "I'm exactly where I want to be." And then they joined, slowly, carefully, with a tenderness that completely contrasted with the intensity of desire between them. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, a complete fusion of two souls that had finally found their place. Carol held her breath for a moment, adjusting, and Preston remained completely still, giving her the time she needed. When she finally relaxed and nodded, He began to move, slow, rhythmic, eyes never leaving hers. "You make me feel whole," he whispered against her lips, his voice rough with emotion. "You make me feel alive," she replied, hands holding his shoulders. They moved together in perfect synchrony, building something that went beyond physical pleasure. It was connection. It was healing. It was love in its purest and most vulnerable form. When they finally reached climax together, it was as if the world around them disappeared completely. Only they existed, ragged breaths, hearts beating in unison, souls intertwined in a way nothing else could undo. Afterward, they remained lying together, intertwined. Preston pulled her into his arms, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat gradually calm. He traced lazy circles with his fingers on her back, and she drew invisible patterns on his chest. "I love you," Preston whispered against her hair, kissing the top of her head. "More than I thought it was possible to love someone." Carol raised her face to look at him, resting her chin on his chest. "I love you too," she said, and this time the words came out easy, natural. "And I'm not afraid to admit it anymore." He smiled, that genuine, rare smile that completely transformed his face. "Good, because I plan to spend the rest of my life reminding you of that." She laughed softly, a gentle, happy laugh he'd never heard before. "The rest of your life? That's a long time, Mr. Blackwood." "It's not long enough," he replied, pulling her back into his arms. "It'll never be long enough with you." They remained like that for hours, talking quietly about dreams and fears, about the past that haunted them, and the uncertain future that awaited them. Preston spoke about the mother he'd lost as a child, about how he grew up alone, even surrounded by people. Carol spoke about the fragmented memories of the orphanage, about how she learned to be invisible to protect herself, and as they shared their stories, they realized something fundamental. Both had grown up alone, both had learned to survive without support, both had built walls around their hearts. But now in that small apartment in the Bronx, lit only by the faint light of the moon coming through the narrow window, those walls finally crumbled completely. "Promise me something," Carol said eventually, tracing invisible patterns on his chest. "Anything. Promise that no matter how difficult it gets, no matter how many storms come, you'll fight for us." Preston held her hand, intertwining their fingers, and brought it to his lips, kissing each finger gently. "I promise," he said with absolute conviction. "I'll fight for us until my last breath. Because you're not just someone I love, Carol. You're my home. And I protect my home with everything I have." Carol felt tears return, but this time they were tears of pure happiness. "How do you always know exactly what to say?" "Because you inspire me to be honest," he replied, pulling her closer. "For the first time in my life, I don't need to wear masks or play games. I can just be." She kissed his chest, right above his heart. "Then be. Be yourself. With me. Always. Always," he echoed, kissing the top of her head. And as the night advanced and the city outside continued its frenetic life, Preston and Carol remained intertwined. Two hearts finally finding rest, two souls finally finding peace, two people finally finding what they'd always searched for without knowing. Home. Not a place, but a person. Each other. And although they knew the world would try to separate them, that storms would come and battles would need to be fought, that night they chose to believe in something stronger than any obstacle. They chose to believe in love. And sometimes that's all we need to face the impossible. Morning arrived soft and golden, invading the small apartment through the narrow window. Carol woke first, still wrapped in Preston's arms, and for a moment allowed herself to just watch him sleeping. He looked different like this, younger, more vulnerable, free from the weight he constantly carried on his shoulders when awake. She lightly traced the line of his jaw with her fingers, and he woke slowly, a smile forming on his lips before he even fully opened his eyes. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," she replied quietly. Preston pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair and inhaling deeply, as if wanting to memorize even her scent. "I could wake up like this every day for the rest of my life," he said against her hair. Carol smiled, but reality began to infiltrate the perfect moment. Outside, the world still existed, and with it, all the battles they would need to face. "Preston," she began hesitantly. "What are you going to do?" "About your father. About everything." He pulled back just enough to face her, his dark grey eyes serious and determined. "I'm going to destroy everything," he said simply. "Every rotten part of this empire that was built on suffering. I'm going to expose every crime, every scheme, every lie. And I'm going to start with Project Aurora." Carol felt a chill run down her spine. "Preston, you know what that means. You're not just going to lose your inheritance. You're going to completely destroy your family's name. You might even face legal consequences by association." "I know," he replied without hesitation, "and I don't care. Because if it protects you, if it protects all the other children who were used, I'll burn my entire name without thinking twice." Carol held his face with both hands. "Are you absolutely sure? Because once you do this, there's no going back." Preston covered her hands with his, keeping them against his face. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." In the following hours, Preston made calls, many calls. He contacted investigative journalists from respected publications, lawyers specializing in corporate crimes, even federal agents who had tried to investigate Blackwood Enterprises years ago but were blocked by political connections and money. Carol watched him work, the determination on his face, the way he meticulously organized each document, each piece of evidence, each testimony. He wasn't just doing this for her. He was doing it because it was the right thing. And that made her love him even more. 3 days later, Preston called an emergency meeting of the Blackwood Enterprises board. It was a bold and dangerous move, confronting his father in front of the main shareholders and board members, many of whom had been loyal to Harrison for decades. Carol wanted to go with him, but Preston was firm. "No," he said, holding her hands. "This is going to get ugly, very ugly. And I'm not going to expose you to that. Preston, I can handle—" "I know you can," he interrupted gently. "But I need you to be safe. Please, do this for me." She hesitated, but finally nodded. He kissed her for a long time, as if saying goodbye, though they both knew he would return. The meeting took place in the main conference room on the 45th floor, an imposing space with a mahogany table that occupied almost the entire room, surrounded by leather chairs and glass walls that offered an intimidating view of the city. When Preston entered, all eyes turned to him. Harrison was sitting at the head of the table, posture rigid and authoritative, cold eyes studying his son as if he were an adversary in a hostile negotiation. "Good of you to finally decide to show up," Harrison said with sarcasm. "I thought you were too busy with your distraction." Preston ignored the provocation and walked to the other end of the table, placing a thick folder on the polished surface. "I called this meeting because all of you deserve to know the truth about how this empire was built," he began, his voice firm and controlled. "Preston, what do you think you're doing?" Harrison asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What I should have done years ago," Preston replied, opening the folder and beginning to distribute copies of the documents to each board member, bringing to light crimes that have been hidden for too long. Murmurs began to spread through the room as members flipped through the documents. Preston could see confusion, then shock, then horror settling on their faces. "What is this?" one of the main shareholders asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Evidence that the Blackwood Foundation funded orphanages, not for philanthropic purposes, but to have access to vulnerable children who were used in illegal psychological experiments," Preston explained, each word coming out clear and deliberate. "Project Aurora. Dozens of children were subjected to tests without consent, transferred to unregistered facilities, and many disappeared completely from official records." "This is absurd," Harrison stood up abruptly. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "I have all the proof here," Preston retorted, his voice rising slightly. "Medical reports, financial records, bank transfers, even photographs. Everything signed or approved by you, Father." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Harrison, waiting for an explanation, a convincing denial. But he remained standing, jaw tensed, eyes fixed on Preston with pure, distilled hatred. "You don't know what you just did," Harrison said quietly. But the threat was clear. "I know exactly what I did," Preston replied, facing his father without backing down. "I did what you never had the courage to do. I took responsibility for the consequences of your actions." "Consequences?" Harrison laughed bitterly. You want to talk about consequences? I'll show you consequences. He pointed at the door. You're fired, disinherited, removed from any position in this company. And I'll personally make sure no other corporation in this city hires you. You're going to regret being born a Blackwood. Preston showed no visible emotion, but something in his eyes gleamed, not fear, but liberation. I already regret it, Father. Every day. He paused, letting the words sink in. But not for being born, for having carried this name with honor when it never deserved it. He turned to the other board members. You have a choice to make. You can continue protecting a man who built all of this on the suffering of innocence, or you can do the right thing. Preston gathered his documents. But know this, everything in these folders has already been sent to newspapers, federal authorities, and human rights organizations. The truth is coming out. The only question is whether you'll be on the right side when it does. He walked toward the door, but stopped when Harrison spoke again. That girl, she's going to destroy you, Preston. That kind of love only brings ruin. Preston turned one last time, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but loaded with unshakable certainty. Then let ruin come. Because I'd rather be destroyed beside her than build an empire on the ashes of innocent children. And he left, leaving behind a stunned silence and a father who finally realized he'd lost control over his only son. In the following weeks, hell broke loose. The news exploded. All major newspapers published detailed investigations about Project Aurora. Federal authorities opened formal inquiries. Shareholders began withdrawing investments. Blackwood Enterprises' stock value plummeted, and Harrison fought. He hired the best lawyers, used all his political connections, tried to bury the story under mountains of lawsuits and intimidation, but it was too late. The truth had escaped, and there was no way to contain it. Preston, in turn, lost everything materially. His bank account was frozen, his access to the penthouse was revoked. He became, overnight, just another ordinary man trying to survive in a ruthless city. But when he returned to Carol's small apartment that first night, after being completely cut off from the family, she opened the door and pulled him inside without hesitation. I have nothing, he said, his voice loaded with raw vulnerability. No money, no position, no name worth anything. Just me. Carol held his face with both hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. You were always enough, she said firmly. The money, the name, the power, none of that mattered. It was you. It was always you. Preston pulled her into a tight embrace, and she felt his body tremble slightly against hers, all the weight of what he'd done finally falling on him. I don't regret it, he murmured against her hair. Not a single decision, but I'm afraid of what comes next. Then we'll be afraid together, Carol whispered back, and we'll face whatever comes, together. They stood there for long minutes, holding each other while the world outside crumbled. But inside that small apartment, something new was being built. Not an empire of glass and steel, but a foundation of love, truth, and courage. And maybe, just maybe, that was stronger than anything money could buy. The months following the public fall of Blackwood Enterprises were chaotic and relentless. The media dissected every detail of the scandal. Victims of Project Aurora began to come forward, now traumatized adults who finally found their voice to tell their stories. Lawsuits piled up, and at the center of everything, like a hurricane of rage and revenge, stood Harrison Blackwood. He wouldn't accept defeat silently. Preston and Carol had moved to an even smaller but safer apartment in a less well-known part of Brooklyn. Preston got a job at a small consulting firm. Nothing compared to what he had before, but honest, clean. Carol continued working as a cleaner, but now with plans to go back to school. Together, they were building something new, something real. But Harrison's shadow hung over them constantly. It was a cold December night when everything came to a head. Preston received an unexpected message from an unknown number. If you want to end this once and for all, come to the mansion, alone, tonight. He showed the message to Carol and immediately saw the fear in her eyes. It's a trap, she said, holding the phone with trembling hands. You can't go. I have to, Preston replied calmly, though his heart was racing. He'll never stop until we have this final confrontation, and I'd rather face him on his terms than wait for him to come to us. Then I'm going with you. Carol? No, she interrupted firmly. You said we were a team, that we'd face everything together. So don't ask me to stay behind now, not when it matters most. Preston studied her face, the determination in her tensed jaw, the fire in her eyes that he'd learned to love. He knew there was no point in arguing. Okay, he finally agreed, but you stay behind me, always. Deal. They arrived at the old Blackwood mansion shortly after midnight. It was an imposing Gothic building on the outskirts of Manhattan, built generations ago and now surrounded by an aura of decay and secrets. The main gate was slightly open, a silent invitation, or an obvious trap. Preston held Carol's hand tightly as they walked along the stone path to the main entrance. The wind blew hard, carrying dry leaves and the smell of imminent rain. Distant thunder echoed in the dark sky. The door opened before they could knock. A large man, clearly a hired security guard, silently guided them through the dark, poorly lit hallways until they reached the main hall. And there stood Harrison Blackwood. He was standing in front of a lit fireplace, hands behind his back, watching the flames dance. He wore an impeccable suit, as always, but there was something different about him. He seemed smaller, older, defeated perhaps, but still dangerous. You came, Harrison said without turning, and you brought her. How predictable. You asked me to come, Preston replied, keeping Carol slightly behind him. So here I am. What do you want? Harrison finally turned, and Carol saw the pure hatred in his eyes when they landed on her. She ruined everything, he said simply, pointing at Carol. You had a bright future, power, influence, legacy, and you threw it all away for a worthless orphan. Careful, Preston warned, his voice low and dangerous. Harrison ignored the warning and took a few steps toward them. Do you know how many generations worked to build what we had? How many sacrifices were made? Sacrifices? Preston laughed bitterly. You call using innocent children as guinea pigs sacrifices? Destroying lives to feed your greed? I call it doing what was necessary, Harrison roared, losing his composure for the first time. You were always weak, Preston. Always felt too much. Just like your pathetic mother. Preston took a step forward, but Carol held his arm, keeping him in place. He's not worth it, she whispered. Ah, look at that, Harrison mocked. The whore giving advice to the fallen prince. Carol felt Preston tense completely beside her, about to lunge forward, but she stepped forward before he could. I'll tell you something, Mr. Blackwood, Carol said, her voice clear and firm. You can call me whatever you want. You can try to diminish me, humiliate me, make me feel small, but it won't work, because I know who I am. I'm a survivor. I'm someone who grew up with nothing and still found strength, and I have something you never had and never will. And what would that be? Harrison asked with contempt. True love, she replied simply. Someone who chose me not for what I can offer, but for who I am. And you? You're going to die alone, surrounded by money and power, but without anyone who really cares. The silence that followed was thick. Harrison looked at Carol as if seeing her truly for the first time, and something in his expression changed. Not regret, but perhaps recognition of a truth he'd denied his entire life. You don't understand what you've done, Harrison said finally, his voice lower. The empire is falling, stock prices plummeted, I'm being federally investigated, and all because of you two. No, Preston corrected. Because of you. Because of the choices you made. We just brought to light what you hid for decades. Harrison took a few more steps, and that's when Carol noticed. He wasn't just defeated, he was desperate, and desperate men were unpredictable. If I'm going down, Harrison said, his hand sliding to the inside pocket of his jacket, then I'm taking you with me. Everything happened in slow motion. Harrison pulled a gun. Preston pushed Carol aside forcefully. A shot echoed through the hall, deafening and final. Carol fell on the marble floor, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. When she looked up, she saw Preston fallen a few meters ahead, a red stain spreading on his white shirt. No! She screamed, crawling to him. Harrison remained standing, gun still in hand, face pale as if he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd done. Security guards began entering the hall, drawn by the sound of the shot. Carol reached Preston, hands desperately pressing the wound on his chest. Blood. So much blood. Warm and viscous flowing between her fingers. Preston. No, she cried, tears falling freely. Don't leave me. You promised. You promised you'd fight. He opened his eyes with effort, and even through the pain managed to smile slightly. I'm fighting, he whispered, his voice weak. You're not going to die, Carol said firmly, though her own voice was breaking. I fought too hard to lose you now. You hear me? You're not going to die. She looked around desperately. One of the guards was already calling an ambulance. Another had disarmed Harrison, who was now sitting in a chair, staring fixedly at his own hands stained with his son's blood. Carol, Preston whispered, and she turned all her attention back to him. Shh, don't talk. Save your energy. Need to say, he insisted, his hand trembling as he tried to reach her face. She held his hand, pressing it against her cheek. I love you, he said, each word costing immense effort. Always, always will love you. And I love you, she replied, kissing his palm. So you're going to survive because our story doesn't end like this. It doesn't end here. Sirens began to sound outside. Paramedics rushed in, gently moving Carol aside while they worked on Preston. She watched them, hands still covered with his blood, heart beating so hard it felt like it wanted to burst from her chest. Please, she whispered to no one in particular. Please, let him stay. The trip to the hospital was a blur. Carol accompanied the ambulance in a police car, answering questions mechanically while her mind was completely focused on Preston. He needs to survive. He needs to. The next few hours were the longest of her life. She walked the sterile hospital corridors, the smell of disinfectant burning her nostrils, nurses rushing past, low voices whispering around her, and she just waited and prayed and waited more. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a doctor came out of the operating room. Family of Preston Blackwood? Carol stood immediately, her legs almost giving out. I'm all he has. The doctor studied her for a moment, then nodded. He survived. The surgery was complicated, but we managed to remove the bullet. He lost a lot of blood, and the next few days will be critical, but he has good chances of complete recovery. Carol felt her knees weaken. A nurse gently held her, helping her sit. He's going to be okay? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. If he keeps fighting like he fought until now, yes, the doctor replied with a small smile. You can see him in a few minutes. When they finally allowed Carol into the ICU room, she almost broke down again. Preston was pale, connected to various monitors and tubes, but he was alive. His chest rose and fell rhythmically. His heart beat on the monitor. She approached slowly and gently held his hand. You survived, she whispered, tears returning. You stubborn, wonderful idiot. You survived. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused from medication, but when they found hers, a small smile formed. Promised I'd fight, he whispered weakly. Carol laughed through tears and kissed his hand. And you kept your promise. Like always. Months passed. Preston recovered slowly but completely. Harrison Blackwood was arrested, facing multiple charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The Blackwood Empire collapsed completely, but from its ashes something new began to emerge. Preston and Carol together opened a shelter for orphaned children, built literally on the ruins of the old Blackwood mansion that had been demolished. They called it Aurora House, not as a reminder of the terrible project, but as a symbol of a new beginning, a new dawn. It was a sunny spring afternoon when they stood side by side, watching children run through the newly built garden, their laughter filling the air in a way that place had never known. We did it, Carol said quietly, intertwining her fingers with Preston's. You did it, he corrected, squeezing her hand. You taught me that legacies aren't built with money or power. They're built with love, with right choices, with the courage to do what's right even when it's hard. Carol turned to face him, and he mirrored the movement. I don't want a last name, she said, echoing words he'd said months ago. I want a future by your side. Preston smiled, that genuine, complete smile she loved so much. Then we build that future, together, one day at a time. And then he pulled her into a kiss. Tender, strong, definitive. A kiss that sealed not just their love, but also the promise that no matter how many storms came, they would face them side by side. Because true love isn't about perfection. It's about choice, about fighting, about staying. And they had chosen, fought, and stayed. Together, forever. In the end, Carol and Preston discovered that true empires aren't built with money or power, but with the courage to face the past and choose love, even when everything conspires against it. They proved that tainted legacies can be redeemed, that scars can transform into strength, and that two broken souls can heal together. What began as an impossible encounter between an invisible cleaning lady and a ruthless heir became proof that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply to love without fear. Because in the end, it doesn't matter where we came from. What matters is who we choose to be. And they chose love, always. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. And if you felt it was really worth it, hit the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us keep bringing you stories like this. Until the next story.